November 1944. A captured field hospital near Metz, France. American medics step through a shattered doorway into an eerie, silent ward. Cold winter wind rattles a broken window pane, but inside, the air carries a heavy, metallic odor. Rows of green canvas cots line the room, each holding a motionless figure under wool blankets. Intravenous lines still hang from metal poles, dripping saline onto the concrete floor. Paper charts remain clipped to the foot of each frame, documenting recovery progress and pulse rates. The medics approach the nearest bed, expecting the groans of wounded men left behind during the chaotic retreat. Instead, they find cold skin and a dark crimson stain on the pillow. Every single man in the ward is dead. General George S. Patton will soon stand in this blood-soaked room and issue a devastating directive that forever alters how his army handles the retreating enemy. This is the story of what General George S. Patton discovered when his Third Army advanced into a liberated field hospital and found 17 wounded men executed in their beds. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what the war revealed when the walls came down. Captain Helen Rourke was 32 years old, an Army Nurse Corps officer from Albany, New York. She had joined the military right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a comfortable civilian nursing job because she believed her skills belonged where the fighting was heaviest. Before arriving in France, she had spent months in crowded hospital tents in North Africa, treating dust-choked infantrymen and learning how to ignore the constant thunder of distant artillery. She was an absolute professional who had seen every manner of trauma the human body could endure, yet nothing in her training had prepared her for the sheer malice of an enemy who targeted the helpless. On that November morning, she stood inside a dark supply closet, her back pressed against the wood, listening to the methodical, rhythmic cracks of a pistol firing just inches away on the other side of the wall. SS-Obersturmbannführer Friedrich Vogt was 39 years old, a career officer from Hamburg who viewed the conflict through a lens of absolute icy certainty. He wore a tailored winter tunic that remained immaculate despite the muddy landscape, and his leather boots were polished to a high mirror shine. Vogt belonged to a class of ideological zealots who believed that international treaties were sentimental weaknesses designed to hamper the strong. His personal philosophy was simple, and he had often stated that any resource left to the enemy was a direct betrayal of his own nation's survival. When his unit briefly retook the medical facility during a sudden counterattack, he did not see wounded men recovering under the protection of a Red Cross. He saw 17 potential enemy infantrymen who might eventually return to the front lines to fire upon his own troops. He walked down the center aisle of the ward with a Walther P-38 drawn, checking the name tags on each bed frame with the detached concentration of an auditor balancing a ledger. The fighting around Metz had turned into a brutal, sluggish battle of attrition as the late autumn mud slowed the American advance. The German army was retreating toward the borders of the Reich, but they were contesting every ridge, every stone farmhouse, and every flooded trench with desperate ferocity. Supplies on both sides were dwindling rapidly under the relentless strain of the weather and the disrupted rail lines. In this atmosphere of systemic collapse, the traditional boundaries of civilized warfare began to erode along the front line. Retreating commanders faced immense pressure from Berlin to minimize casualties and slow the Allied momentum by any means available. Many senior officers chose to overlook the excessive measures taken by their rear guards, viewing harsh actions as a regrettable necessity of total defeat. Under normal circumstances, a captured medical facility would be bypassed or preserved as a neutral zone under the strict guidelines of international law. The Geneva Convention had been designed precisely to prevent the chaos of the battlefield from entering the sanctuary of the hospital ward. Yet, as the German lines fractured, some units abandoned these legal constraints entirely, treating hospitals as mere military obstacles. Entire divisions were collapsing, communication networks were failing, and the moral structure that kept armies from descending into savagery was dissolving in the rain. American commanders had already heard rumors of isolated atrocities along the path of the retreat, but most dismissed them as the inevitable exaggerations of combat panic. No one in the higher echelons of the Third Army expected to find an organized, deliberate execution squad operating inside a facility clearly marked with a red cross. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the absolute limits of military discipline. The quiet ward near Metz was about to become the center of a grim investigation. An American captain from the medical corps arrived at the facility to establish a temporary triage station. He walked into the main office, expecting to find the retreating German officer coordinating a handover of the remaining non-ambulatory patients. Instead, he found Friedrich Vogt sitting behind a heavy oak desk, calmly sipping a cup of coffee. The American captain pulled out a copy of the regional evacuation manifest and placed it on the desk. He asked the German officer to account for the patients listed in the log books, explaining that the division needed to log every individual left behind in the sector. Vogt did not look at the paperwork. He took another sip of his coffee and said that there were no patients to account for. The American captain frowned, pointing to the names on the manifest. He said that 17 wounded men had been left in the ward, according to the previous reports from the local medical orderlies. He stated that international regulations guaranteed these men safe passage and proper treatment under the Red Cross banner. Vogt smiled thinly, adjusted his tailored uniform jacket, and stood up from the desk. He said that the names on the paper were no longer relevant to the military situation. He explained that his orders were absolute, and that he had been instructed to deny the advancing enemy any recoverable manpower that could be used in future operations. The American captain stepped closer, raising his voice slightly to demand a clear explanation. He asked if the men had been transferred to another facility deeper within the German lines before the retreat began. He reminded the officer that moving severely injured men without adequate transportation was a direct violation of the standing rules of civilized warfare. Vogt looked down at his polished leather boots and chuckled softly. He said that he had not wasted fuel on men who could not stand. He stated that the Geneva Convention was a document written by weak men for an era that no longer existed. He looked directly at the captain and said that the convention did not apply to those who could not be moved, because a soldier who cannot walk is merely a burden to his own side and a future asset to the enemy. He admitted that he had walked from bed to bed and personally used his pistol to ensure that none of those 17 men would ever rejoin the fight. The American captain felt a chill run down his spine as the realization hit him. He looked at the German officer, seeing no remorse, only an icy, methodical indifference. He realized that this situation was far beyond his authority to handle or negotiate. He turned on his heel, walked out of the room, and immediately contacted the Tactical Command Center. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate. 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked in unannounced. Every man in the room snapped to attention, freezing in mid-motion as the cold air from the open door swirled around the blood-stained cots. Patton studied him. He looked at the immaculate uniform of the German officer, then at the clipboard hanging from the nearest bed frame. Patton said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried. He asked Friedrich Vogt if he was the commanding officer who signed the medical logs. Vogt nodded. Patton asked if he had read the names on the tags before using his pistol. Vogt stated he had verified each man was an enemy combatant. Patton asked if he understood what a red cross painted on a roof meant. Vogt replied, it meant nothing when manpower had to be denied to the advancing enemy. Patton looked down at the floor, his face carved from stone. He told the German officer that a man who fights with a rifle is a soldier, but a man who executes the helpless in their beds is a common criminal. He said that the uniform Vogt wore did not grant him the right to act as a butcher, nor did his orders absolve him of the blood on the sheets. He pointed out that Captain Helen Rourke and her staff had counted 17 distinct shots through the closet wall, each one a calculated murder of a man who could not lift his arms to defend himself. he told Vogt that the American army did not execute the wounded, nor did it tolerate those who did. He gave the German officer two options. He could stand in the center of the town square and publicly confess his actions to the gathered citizens and the international press, or he could face an immediate military tribunal under the charge of mass murder without the protections of a prisoner of war. Patton told him he had 10 seconds to choose his path, and either way, his days of hiding behind a tailored uniform were finished. Vogt remained silent, his jaw clenched, refusing to speak. Patton turned to his military police commander and ordered the immediate arrest of the German officer. He commanded that Friedrich Vogt be stripped of his sidearms, his decorated uniform coat, and his polished boots. Under the watchful eyes of the surrounding American infantrymen, the military police marched the prisoner out into the freezing mud of the hospital courtyard. Patton ordered that every liberated medical facility in the sector be cordoned off with heavy wire and treated strictly as an active crime scene. A dedicated team of intelligence officers and photographic specialists immediately began documenting the entire ward, measuring the distance from the doorway to each bed, and gathering the blood-stained clipboards as evidence. The local civilian population was brought into the courtyard to witness the arrest, forcing them to look upon the commander who had brought such disgrace to their town. Vogt stood shivering in the cold rain, his feet sinking into the freezing mire, as the townspeople watched him in absolute silence. The American soldiers stood guard with fixed bayonets, ensuring that the prisoner remained exposed to the public gaze for hours. Every detail of the ward was logged, every surgical note was preserved, and the physical space of the crime was sealed tight to ensure the truth could never be erased or hidden by the retreating enemy. Captain Helen Rourke went home to Albany, New York. After the cessation of hostilities, she returned to her career in medicine, though she carried the heavy weight of that winter morning near Metz for the rest of her days. She lived a quiet life, dedicated to community health service, until her death in 1984. The memory of the 17 distinct shots never fully left her mind, but she found solace in knowing that her precise testimony had given those silent men a voice when it mattered most. Friedrich Vogt was held in an American military detention center before being transferred to face a war crimes tribunal. He was convicted of multiple counts of cold-blooded murder and violation of international treaties, receiving a life sentence behind bars. He remained unrepentant during his long confinement, frequently writing bitter letters to former comrades, until his death in a German prison cell in 1968. General George S. Patton never spoke about the incident in his public addresses, preferring to keep the graphic details out of the press. He did, however, maintain the full investigative file within a locked drawer in his mobile office desk throughout the remainder of the European campaign. In a private journal entry written just days before his fatal accident in December 1945, the general noted that an army which loses its respect for the wounded loses its right to victory. Some historians have argued that the brutal pressures of the collapsing Western Front made such frontline decisions inevitable for desperate field commanders. They contend that the rapid advance of the Third Army forced quick tactical choices regarding potential enemy combatants left in the rear. Others have argued the opposite, stating that no logistical strain or tactical necessity can ever excuse the deliberate execution of immobilized patients under medical care. They maintain that the sanctity of a field hospital must remain absolute to prevent total descent into savagery. What is certain is that Patton's immediate and aggressive documentation of the scene established a permanent legal precedent for liberating forces throughout Europe. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have left the investigation to standard judicial channels later? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what the war revealed when the walls came down, make sure to subscribe.